Let me tell you something that no one talks about. Avoidants do get obsessed. Oh yeah. You think they're cold, detached, emotionless? Think again. Because behind that wall they've built, there's one person they cannot stop thinking about. Not the one who chased them, not the one who begged for love, but the one who flipped the script. The one who walked away with their head high, with self-respect, with boundaries so strong it shook the avoidant to their core. That's the person the avoidant becomes obsessed with. And today, we're going to talk about exactly who that person is and why they hold so much power over someone who spent their whole life running from connection. The power of detachment is something most people underestimate, especially in relationships with avoidant partners. See, the anxious partner is wired to seek closeness, reassurance, and connection. And they often think that the more they love, the more they give, the more they pursue, the more the avoidant will eventually open up. But that strategy backfires every single time. Why? Because the avoidant is wired for space, for independence, for emotional distance. So the more you chase, the more they retreat. The more you try to get closer, the more they pull away. And that dynamic becomes a toxic dance where the anxious person feels rejected and the avoidant feels overwhelmed. But everything changes the moment you detach. And I mean truly detach, not pretending to pull back so they chase you, not using silence as a manipulation tactic, but detaching from the outcome, detaching from the need to fix them, change them, or get them to love you the way you want. That shift in energy, it's magnetic. Because suddenly, you're no longer playing the role they're used to. You're no longer validating their belief that people will always demand too much of them. You're not feeding the dynamic anymore. Instead, you're focused on you, on your peace, on your healing. You stop chasing, stop texting, stop begging to be seen, and start protecting your own energy. And that's the moment the avoidant starts to notice. Not right away, maybe, but slowly, quietly, they feel the difference. Because here's the truth about avoidance. They don't actually want someone who's glued to them. That makes them feel trapped. What they're drawn to, what they secretly crave, is someone who doesn't need them, someone who can walk away, someone who chooses them, but doesn't need to be chosen back to feel whole. That's the person who lives in their mind long after the connection ends. When you detach, you break the cycle. You stop trying to control how they see you. You let them sit with the silence, the loss, the absence of your presence. And that silence becomes loud. Because now they're not being smothered. They're left with their own thoughts, their own fears, their own regret. And that's where obsession begins. Not when you're available, not when you're always there, but when you disappear with dignity, when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop performing for their approval. Avoidants aren't used to that. They're used to being pursued. They're used to being forgiven over and over. They're used to walking away and knowing you'll still be there if they come back. But when you detach, really detach, what you're saying is, I see who you are, and I accept it, but I choose me now. And that terrifies them. Because the game changes. You're not desperate. You're not trying to prove your worth. You've remembered it. Detachment isn't cold. It's powerful. It's what gives you your self-respect back. It's what creates emotional space for clarity, for healing, and most importantly, for choice. You stop operating from fear and start operating from truth. And in that truth, the avoidant sees you differently. Not as the clingy one, not as the emotional one, but as the strong, grounded, self-respecting person they can't stop thinking about. This is why detachment works, because it doesn't beg, it doesn't force, it doesn't perform. It simply exists. It creates a vacuum where your absence is felt more powerfully than your presence ever was when you were chasing them. And that's when the avoidant gets hooked. That's when they start to obsess. Because the person who no longer needs them, the person who let go with peace, the person who walked away without anger, that's the person they can't forget. And it all started the moment you chose to detach. Boundaries. That one word that sends avoidance into panic mode. Not because boundaries are bad, not because they don't understand them, but because real, healthy boundaries force the avoidant to confront something they've spent their entire life avoiding, emotional responsibility. When you finally start setting boundaries, it changes the entire dynamic. You're no longer available at their convenience. You're no longer allowing inconsistent communication, hot and cold behavior, or emotional withdrawal without consequences. And for someone who has learned to feel safe by staying in control and keeping emotional distance, this is deeply triggering. See, avoidants thrive in relationships where they have the upper hand, where they can set the pace, where they can disappear when it feels too close and reappear when they miss the comfort. But boundaries stop that cycle dead in its tracks. Boundaries say, you don't get to come and go whenever you want. Boundaries say, I'm not just here to absorb your moods, your silence, your fear of intimacy. And when you lay down those emotional guardrails, you stop being the safe fallback option. You stop enabling their avoidant behavior, and you start forcing them to take ownership of how they show up. This is what rattles them, because now the avoidant is met with resistance. For the first time, they're not in control of the emotional tone of the relationship. You are. And let me be real with you. That scares them, because the moment you set a boundary, you're no longer fitting into their narrative that people are suffocating, that connection equals control, or that they can't be themselves in a relationship. Instead, you're showing them a version of love that's not codependent. You're showing them that love doesn't mean self-abandonment. And that kind of stability, it's unfamiliar, it's threatening. It forces them to grow or leave. But here's where it gets interesting. The avoidant may resist your boundaries at first. They may pull away harder. They may test you. They might even accuse you of being too much or too difficult, because that's what avoidants do when they feel emotionally exposed. But underneath that defensiveness is fear. Fear that you're no longer tolerating what they got away with before. Fear that your respect for yourself might actually be stronger than your desire for them. And that's a game changer. When you enforce your boundaries consistently, not with aggression, but with calm confidence, you show them that love can exist with limits, that your heart is open, but your standards are high. And while they might push back, part of them respects it. Part of them is drawn to it, because boundaries signal security. Boundaries say, I'm not afraid to lose you if keeping you means losing myself. And that mindset flips the power dynamic. Avoidants are not used to being with someone who doesn't collapse under their withdrawal. They're not used to someone who doesn't go into panic mode when they go silent. But when you hold your boundary, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop trying to fix the disconnect, they're left with themselves. And that's where the shift happens. They start to question their own patterns. They start to feel the cost of their emotional distance, because your boundary creates consequences. And that consequence is your distance, your silence, your absence. The truth is, boundaries aren't about punishment. They're about protection. Your protection, they're about reclaiming your worth after constantly trying to prove it to someone who wasn't emotionally available. And when you do that, when you draw that line and say, this is what I need, this is what I will and will not tolerate, you're no longer easy to manipulate. You're no longer easy to access. And for the avoidant, that changes everything. They might not admit it. They might not even react right away. But make no mistake, your boundaries leave an impression. They break the pattern. They expose the fear they're hiding under their emotional detachment. And deep down, they know they're either going to have to rise to your level or lose you. That realization doesn't just trigger them, it wakes them up. Most people think the way to win over someone with an avoidant attachment style is to try harder, be more patient, be more understanding, show them you're not going anywhere. But that mindset doesn't work. It only reinforces the exact dynamic that pushes them further away. Because pursuit, no matter how well-intentioned, doesn't create desire in the avoidant. It creates pressure. And pressure is the one thing they've been trained to run from their entire lives. If you want an avoidant to see your value, truly feel your worth, it doesn't come from how much you pursue them. It comes from how deeply you respect yourself. See, respect is what shifts the energy. When you stop chasing, when you stop trying to be enough for them to finally stay, and you start showing up for yourself, everything changes. Respect means you're not texting when you know they're emotionally unavailable. Respect means you're not rearranging your whole life to match their inconsistency. Respect is when you decide your peace matters more than their confusion. And the moment you shift from pursuit to self-respect, the dynamic between you and the avoidant breaks wide open. Avoidants are hypersensitive to control. They perceive emotional closeness as a threat to their independence. So when you're pursuing them, when you're constantly available, constantly initiating, constantly trying to fix what they won't even name, they feel cornered. It confirms their worst fear, that being in a relationship means being overwhelmed, being responsible for someone else's feelings, and losing their autonomy. That fear activates their walls. And once those walls go up, no amount of love or chasing gets through. But respect, that cuts through. Not loudly, not emotionally, but powerfully. Because respect is quiet strength. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It says, I love you, but I love me more. It's the decision to walk away from someone who can't meet you emotionally, not to punish them, but to protect your soul. And that shift from chasing to choosing yourself is what makes the avoidant stop and think. Because now they're not feeling smothered. Now they're feeling the weight of your absence. And in that silence, they realize that what they thought they needed, space, distance, detachment, isn't nearly as satisfying as the respect they just lost. The person who earns the avoidance obsession isn't the one who never gives up. It's the one who knew when to stop. It's the one who didn't fight their walls but refused to shrink for them. That's what respect looks like. It's knowing your worth and refusing to prove it. And for someone who's used to being emotionally pursued, that kind of detachment doesn't read as rejection. It reads as power. Real power. The kind that says, say you don't get to define me. And that's the moment they begin to respect you. What avoidants remember, what haunts them long after the breakup, is the person who didn't stay in the pattern, the one who didn't keep showing up after being pushed away, the one who stopped trying to earn love that should have been freely given. That person commands respect, not just from the avoidant, but from themselves. And that's what changes the whole story, because pursuit might get their attention for a moment, but respect, that stays with them. That leaves an impression, that triggers reflection, and maybe, just maybe, that starts the growth they never knew they needed. Pursuit says, please pick me. Respect says, see, I already chose myself. And when you move in that energy, you stop trying to get them to wake up, and you become the wake-up call. There's a moment in every dynamic with an avoidant where the energy shifts. At first, you're the one chasing. You're the one initiating, over-explaining, trying to soothe, trying to close the emotional gap. You feel like if you just love them hard enough, they'll eventually come around. But they don't. Instead, the more you chase, the more they withdraw. The more you give, the less they reciprocate. And that dynamic wears you down. Until one day, you stop. You don't say it out loud, but something in you clicks. You're done begging. You're done proving. You're done trying to pull love out of someone who only gives it when it's safe and convenient for them. That's the moment everything changes. That's the shift from chaser to challenge. Avoidants aren't consciously looking to hurt you. They're protecting themselves. Their walls, their distance, their shutdowns, they're all shields. And when you chase, they feel justified in keeping those shields up. But when you become a challenge, not by playing games, but by standing firm in your self-worth, they start to notice. Because now you're not reacting the way they expect. You're not reinforcing the cycle. You're not falling into the trap of over-functioning while they under-function. You're not feeding their illusion that you're always going to be there. Instead, you become unpredictable in the best way, emotionally self-contained, detached but not cold, loving but no longer leaking that love to someone who hasn't earned it. That's what makes you a challenge. Not someone hard to get, but someone hard to keep without effort, without growth, without showing up. And that kind of energy, it's rare. It shakes them. Because for the first time, they're not in control of the emotional rhythm anymore. You are. You're no longer chasing closeness. You're observing. You're evaluating. You're calm. And in that calm, there's strength. It's not anger. It's clarity. And here's the wild part. Avoidants are drawn to that, not consciously, not immediately, but deeply. Because underneath all that fear of intimacy, they crave depth. They crave connection that feels safe but real. And when you stop chasing and start embodying your standards, you become that safe, real thing they thought didn't exist. You stop being the person who needs them to feel okay. You start being the person who's okay either way. And that makes you unforgettable. Now, being a challenge doesn't mean withholding love. It doesn't mean manipulating or pretending to not care. It means not abandoning yourself for the sake of keeping someone else comfortable. It means showing up in your fullness with your needs, your boundaries, your truth, and letting the chips fall where they may. That's what disrupts the avoidant pattern, because they can't dance the same dance with you anymore. You're not chasing them into their silence. You're not rescuing them from their emotional avoidance. You're standing still and saying, this is who I am. You're welcome to meet me here, but I'm not coming to chase you down anymore. And maybe they don't realize it right away. Maybe they retreat even more. But trust me, when the chaser becomes the challenge, the avoidant starts to feel something they haven't felt in a long time: intrigue. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you're finally being hard to get for the right reasons: your peace, your boundaries, your evolution. And they start to realize they're not just losing someone who cared, they're losing someone who grew, someone who outgrew the cycle, someone who transformed right in front of them. That transformation is what lingers, because anyone can chase. Anyone can love loudly. But the person who learns to love quietly, with strength, with dignity, with standards, that person becomes unforgettable. That person becomes the one who no longer needs validation, the one who no longer makes it easy, the one who becomes the mirror, forcing the avoidant to confront themselves. And once you've made that shift, you never go back, because you don't want the chase anymore. You want peace. You want alignment. And when the avoidant realizes that they're not just losing attention, they're losing access to someone they thought they had figured out, that's when obsession starts. That's when your silence says more than your words ever could, because now you're not chasing them. They're chasing the version of you that chose to walk away with power. Obsession doesn't grow when you're constantly available. It doesn't grow when you're explaining yourself, checking in, or trying to remind someone what they're about to lose. Obsession grows in absence, in silence, in the void left behind when someone who once gave their energy so freely suddenly stops. That's when the avoidant starts to feel something they're not used to: loss, real loss. Not the kind they manufacture by pulling away first, but the kind that creeps in after you've gone quiet, after you've stopped performing, after you've stopped fighting for closeness they never reciprocated. That's when your presence becomes louder in its absence than it ever was when you were right in front of them. See, avoidance needs space. That's how they self-soothe. That's how they regulate when intimacy feels like a threat. But what they're not prepared for is when you stop filling that space, when you stop waiting for them to return, when you stop orbiting around their emotional unavailability. That's when the space they thought they needed turns into emptiness. Because the truth is, it wasn't your neediness that pushed them away. It was their fear of closeness. And now, in your absence, they're left with nothing to run from and no one to run to. And here's what most people don't realize. Avoidants don't miss you right away. They miss you later. When the silence stretches too long, when the new distractions don't feel like connection, when they start to remember how safe you felt, how steady you were, how deeply you cared without conditions. But now you're gone. You're not reaching out. You're not playing the emotional lifeguard anymore. And that's when obsession sets in, not with who you were when you chased, but with who you became when you stopped. In the absence, they start playing the memories back, not because they want to, but because the mind clings to what was consistent, what was warm, what was emotionally available. You were once the constant, always reaching, always responding, always showing up. But now there's silence. And that silence makes them question everything. Were you really needy? Or were they emotionally unavailable? Was the pressure real? Or were they just terrified of being seen? Those questions don't come when you're still around. They come when you disappear with grace, when you stop defending your worth, when you let them sit in the consequences of emotional distance. Avoidants aren't wired for vulnerability, but they are wired for pattern recognition. And when you break the pattern, when you no longer react to their withdrawal, when you no longer run after them, they feel the shift. And suddenly, the emotional weight they refuse to carry becomes their own. That's when the obsession starts to grow, because now they're chasing closure that doesn't exist. Now they're replaying the connection that ended without a grand finale. You just stopped giving, stopped pushing, stopped proving. And that lack of resolution, that unsettles them more than any fight ever could. This is why your absence is more powerful than your presence ever was during the chase, because in absence, there's mystery. There's space for regret. There's time for reflection. And for an avoidant who has spent their entire life avoiding feelings, reflection can be excruciating, but necessary. They start to remember your laugh, your calm, your loyalty, The way you never asked for too much, only for what was fair. And now they start to wonder, why did I run? Why did I push that away? Why didn't I just let myself receive it? That's the beginning of their obsession, not with controlling you, but with understanding what they lost. So if you're wondering whether they think about you after you walk away, yes. Not because you begged for it, but because you didn't. Because you chose silence over performance, peace over chaos, dignity over desperation. And that energy, that's unforgettable. That's the energy that lives in their head, not just as a memory, but as a lesson. You became the one that got away. Not because you disappeared, but because when they distanced themselves, you didn't follow. You let go. And that, right there, is when the avoidance starts to obsess, because now you're not a memory they can control. You're the standard they can't forget. So here's what you need to hear loud and clear. The avoidant doesn't become obsessed with the one who chased. They become obsessed with the one who changed, the one who stopped fighting for scraps of connection, the one who realized that love isn't proven by persistence, it's proven by presence. And when that presence is no longer available, it hits them hard because your absence holds them accountable in ways your words never could. You stop being the emotional safety net. You stop playing the role of the always available, always forgiving partner. And that shift from chaser to challenge, from overgiver to boundary setter, that's what haunts them. That's what lingers. That's what turns curiosity into obsession. Because now they're not just thinking about what you were. They're thinking about who you became when you realized you deserved better. You didn't lose them. They lost you. They lost someone who was patient, real, loving, and loyal. And while they were busy avoiding closeness, you were learning how to reclaim your power. You were learning that love without respect is just emotional servitude. And when you finally stopped showing up for their comfort and started showing up for your own peace, that's when they started waking up. So if you're sitting there wondering whether they feel your absence, wondering if they're thinking about you, yes. But more importantly, you need to feel your presence. You need to remember who you are when you're no longer chasing validation. Because the real shift isn't about making them obsessed. It's about becoming someone you're obsessed with. Someone who knows their worth, holds their ground, and never begs to be chosen again. Let them wonder. Let them regret. Let them sit in the silence they created. You've already moved on from proving your value to embodying it. And that's the most powerful move you'll ever make.